Welcome to the Peer Support Podcast. Today's podcast is about stress and is presented to you by Rachel, that's me, hello, Andrea.
Hello, that's me, welcome everyone.
And Holly.
Hello everyone.
And we are peer support workers who work within the Wellbeing Service. Joining us today will be Dan.
Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast.
And Eleanor.
Hi there everyone.
Who are psychological wellbeing practitioners within the Wellbeing Service. Today's podcast will cover what are peer support workers, what are psychological wellbeing practitioners, what is stress, top tips for managing stress, and sharing peer support workers' lived experiences of managing stress. We hope that you come away from today's podcast with an understanding of stress and tips for managing it. So just in case you're listening today and you don't know what a peer support worker does, here's a little explanation. So peer support workers all have their own experience of living with mental health challenges, and we share our experience of this with others, along with our recovery stories to offer hope. We use our experience of recovery to help people to make sense of what they are going through and to explore what may support them in their recovery. So we've got some psychological wellbeing practitioners with us today, and I'd just like to hand over to Eleanor if she wouldn't mind giving us a little explanation of their role.
Yeah, of course. So psychological wellbeing practitioners, or PWPs, we support and empower people to develop and use coping strategies to manage common mental health difficulties. So things such as stress, low mood, depression, and also anxiety.
Eleanor. So like I said, today's podcast is all about stress. So I'd just like to hand over to Dan, if I may, and say, Dan, what exactly is stress?
Thanks, Rachel. So, yeah, I guess stress is very common vernacular, isn't it, within society? And I think really, firstly, kind of getting across that kind of stress isn't inherently a bad thing. We consider stress to kind of be on a spectrum, and actually we can experience what we might consider good stress. And actually, perhaps it's nigh on impossible to go through life without experiencing some degree of stress within our lifetimes. And I'd even offer the thought that kind of life would be pretty boring stress-free. So what is good stress, perhaps? Well, to provide an example, perhaps we've just applied for a job and it's a role that we're really keen to have. And we're fortunate enough to get an interview. And understandably, there's some high stakes here, isn't there? So it's understandable that we might have some apprehensions, some increased feelings of anxiety. We might start to worry about how the interview might go, etc. And kind of that stress and anxiety at a reasonably manageable level will actually be beneficial for us, because it would put us in a position where we can research the company, know what we're getting ourselves into, think about what questions they may ask, and as we go into the interview, perhaps we're kind of feeling kind of those feelings of anxiety and increased heartbeat, etc. But again, at a reasonably manageable level, that's actually going to put us in a position to probably do quite well in the interview. Actually, kind of that stress will be beneficial for us. We'll be more cognitively aware. We'll be more tuned into our surroundings. But I think when stress becomes a problem is when that stress gets to a point where the demands placed upon us, and when we talk about demands, we're talking about life experiences, our responsibilities, etc. When those demands exceed our capabilities and resources in managing them, and it's at that point where problems may start developing. And when we talk about those problems, typically what we find under huge degrees of stress, typically we might experience increased feelings of anxiety, for example, anxiety and worry, or we might notice a lowered mood, or typically we might experience a bit of both, some increased anxiety and low mood as well.
Thank you, Dan. That's really interesting, particularly what you said about kind of good stress, because, you know, we don't necessarily think that stress is kind of a helpful thing. But as you were talking, I was just thinking about the stress that I have each time we record a podcast. You know, it's not a bad stress. It's a stress that makes me, you know, put together the podcast, that makes me think, right, what's going to work? What do we need to remove? And it kind of gives me that enthusiasm for doing these podcasts. podcast, and it's a very different feeling to the stress that I would have, that, like you said, when the demands are placed on me are exceeding what I feel that I can do. So thank you, that's really interesting. And what we were thinking about is, in terms of the peer support workers, was our own experiences of living with stress or sort of dealing with stress. And I know myself, I felt like I was living underwater. So anything could have happened. I could have hurt myself, the world could have ended. I wouldn't have known, because simply everything was muted and I was just existing. I wasn't living. It was a very sort of strange kind of feeling, but yeah, completely like I was kind of switched off from things. And we asked the wider peer support worker teams, their examples. And Holly, would you kind of like to start us off with what they were saying?
Yeah, of course. So one of our peer support workers told us that stress was like a fuel which kept them going. They've said, only when I stopped did I realise how damaging it was, which I think is so often the case, that, it's quite often when we stop and pause, we realise, what we're really feeling and going through.
Thanks, Holly. Andrea, have you got anything there?
Yeah, the next one is that peer support workers said that stress made them make more mistakes. So they were anxious about getting to the next thing, so tended to work more quickly. And I can relate that to my driving lessons and my driving even now. I'd get in the car and I'd be so stressed. I'd make more mistakes. I'd beat myself up, be more anxious. Yeah, so I can see where they're coming from with that one.
And it's interesting, like the previous comment about stress being like a fuel, it's keeping you going, but you're going at such a rate, you're making more mistakes, that's giving you more stress, and it's just kind of keeps going. Holly, have we got any more?
Yeah, so another one of our peer support workers says that they were irritable and snappy with people around them and prone to tears. One that I can certainly relate to. There were a lot of tears, particularly in the beginning when I was really struggling. So, and I think that's quite often the case for a lot of people.
Thank you.
Avoidance of stressful situations in both work and personal lives. So, we avoided to protect ourselves from being in those situations and from failing. And that just makes me think of the amount of times I put off sending an email at work because I'm not sure how to word it properly, and what the response will be if I don't get it right. Or somebody texted me a week ago and I haven't responded and I feel bad, so I put it off for another couple of days. Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? It's like, we're avoiding those stressful situations, but that stress is helping you to make more mistakes. So therefore, you're like, well, I don't want to do that because I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to avoid it. It just keeps going kind of round and round. And Holly, I'll just go back to you for the last example that we've got.
Yeah, so another peer support worker mentioned that how much it affected their sleep, which I think is a really important point. And I know for me, it certainly did that. But for me, it was that I slept more, actually. I overslept. I slept to avoid almost. So, yeah, sleep, a very, very common side effect, I think, of stress.
Yeah. I mean, I know myself, it was, I was either struggling to get to sleep, struggling to stay asleep, or like you say, sleeping so much or deliberately sleeping in so I could avoid those stressful situations, and it's so interesting how this all kind of goes together. Eleanor, are these kind of experiences from the peer support workers things that you kind of hear a lot in your work with people?
Yeah, definitely. So I hear these sorts of experiences a lot, every day when I'm talking to clients, and I think they are really common to experience. And I guess if you're listening to this podcast and sort of relating to a lot of what we're saying, it just shows that you're not alone with these experiences.
I think that's a really good thing to say, Eleanor, because often when we feel like this, like with me sort of feeling like I was living underwater, that was just so isolating, kind of not really understanding what was going on. So yeah, like Eleanor said, if you're listening to this today and thinking, oh goodness me, those are experiences that I've had, they're very common, and you're not alone in the way that you are feeling. So we were kind of thinking about, for today's podcast, really, have we got any top tips for managing stress, both in terms from our PWPs, in terms of the sort of clinical focus that they would have, but also in terms of our peer support workers, in terms of, we've got this lived experience, this is what happened, what did we do, how do we manage these things when they come into our lives now. So the next section of the podcast is really going to be looking at those things. So Eleanor, would you like to start us off with top tips from you for managing stress?
Yeah, definitely. So the first top tip I would say is actually acknowledging how stress is affecting you. So quite often stress affects us in 3 different areas. So for example, you might start to notice changes in how you feel physically. You might start to notice a lot of perhaps physical symptoms in your body when you're stressed. There could also be changes to your thought processes. So you might start to notice, for example, a lot more unhelpful or stressful thoughts. And then finally, another area that often gets impacted by stress is our behaviours. So perhaps there's things you might start doing more or less when you're stressed. And I guess, first tip is to try and acknowledge these changes. And if you start to think, actually, my stress is having quite a big impact on me, it's really important to try and reach out to others for support if you can, whether that's professional support or perhaps family and friends, whatever you feel comfortable with. Because I also know it can be difficult, can't it, to reach out for that support. So it's a good first step to do if you can.
Thanks. Yeah, I like I say, I know for myself that feeling of being underwater, I put up with it because it was like I didn't quite get what that was, because I wasn't actually acknowledging it to myself, and reaching out when I didn't actually know what needed to reach out for was actually really difficult. And Andrea and Holly, I'm kind of thinking that fits really well into sort of self-care and self-compassion. So having the understanding that you're not okay, and actually that is okay, and the things that you would do to support yourself after you've made that acknowledgement. What do you guys think?
Okay, well, as I was listening to Eleanor say that, I was thinking how I was affected when I was at my most stressful point. And physically, I was on the go all the time. And my default basically was, if I'm still doing something, then I must be coping, when in reality I wasn't. Thoughts-wise, it was like I should be able to cope, so why aren't I? That means I'm useless and I'm not good enough. And my behaviour as well, I was doing more for others, basically immersing myself in their lives. If they were grateful, then I was helping somebody else and I was worthwhile. And I also didn't have to think about what was going on for me. What I really should have been doing, and what I've learned, is that I should have been taking more time out for myself, and it wasn't a bad thing to just be taking some time to rest, or just spend an hour watching a television programme. The washing up can wait, the ironing can wait. It's not hurting anybody by still sitting there till the next day. And reaching out to others, really, really important, because I didn't tell anybody for ages, and I think that was because of shame and embarrassment. But as soon as I did, they helped me out. Some of my burdens were taken off of me, and it was surprising that how many of my friends had actually felt the same.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Those first steps that we take, so we've acknowledged how we're feeling, but those first steps that we can take seem so small, but they're actually massive, aren't they? Saying the words, I'm not okay, things are like this, or things like that, actually is a huge part of self-compassion, isn't it, in terms of acknowledging what is going on with us and then trying to put some things in place. So thank you. Dan, I'll go over to you now. So have you got a top tip for managing stress?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the key things that we talk about in wellbeing is this idea of, I guess, kind of re-establishing a routine and a balance of activity. Because I think when we're under stress and we're experiencing perhaps increased feelings of anxiety, stress, lowered mood, etc., as Eleanor identified, that typically there's going to be a physical manifestation of that. We might start to kind of lose our sense of concentration, focus. We might find that our motivation is diminished. Our energy levels are not where they have been before. We're kind of fatigued, tired, etc. So because of that, because of the way that we might be thinking, which we'll come on to in a moment, it's understandable and common, isn't it, that we might withdraw, we become more insular in these moments. We might start avoiding doing certain day-to-day activities, avoiding socializing. Chores start to pile up, don't they? The housework suddenly becomes really kind of insurmountable and unmanageable. So then that kind of creates this vicious cycle where the less we do, the worse we feel. The worse we feel, the less we do. You can imagine as all these kind of tasks kind of pile up, how that exacerbates our stress and anxiety levels, for example. So we know that re-establishing a routine and a balance of activity can be really key in a reduction of stress and an improved mood. And what that might look like really is really kind of thinking about breaking it down and starting small, as you suggested, Rachel. So it might be worth thinking about perhaps activities that you've put off doing, or you're not doing as much of, or you've stopped doing altogether. And think about, if you want to get back into doing these things again, create a plan and start small and write down what it is you're going to be doing and write down when you're going to do it. Evidence suggests that if we write an activity down, we're more likely to follow through with that plan. And it might be, like I say, breaking the activity down. If the housework seems really unmanageable, well, break that down. Can you take it room by room, chore by chore, day by day? And before you know it, kind of what seems suddenly insurmountable suddenly seems a lot more manageable. And what you'll find is it will be difficult at first. You might find that you're not particularly motivated, but with time, you should start to see a lift in your mood and a reduction in the stress levels as well. And on the second point as well, thinking about a balance of activity. Oftentimes when we're feeling stressed, we lose that balance, don't we? Perhaps we only kind of work or do things that we feel responsible for. I'll just do what's necessary, or I'll just kind of divert the energy that I have to kind of children and home life. And oftentimes we don't take much time for ourselves in these moments.
No.
So we always kind of recommend kind of starting to kind of incorporate some self-care, and that could be things along the lines of exercise and relaxation. And again, it's about starting small. So with exercise, it doesn't necessarily mean kind of running a marathon or spending 2 hours in the gym. It could be 10 minutes in the garden, a bit of vigorous housework, for example, just to kind of get those endorphins going and reduce those stress hormones such as cortisol.
Thanks, Dan. I'm really pleased to hear rather that you were saying that it's not about doing a marathon or going to the gym, because I don't know about everyone else in the podcast today, but it's like, oh no, I don't want to do that. So that's a relief to hear that. And yeah, like you say, re-establishing those routines and sort of starting small. I mean, Holly, is there anything that you wanted to sort of add here?
Yeah, routine for me has been incredibly important, particularly throughout the last year. And because which I'm sure I've mentioned before, I'm a big avoider. That's my go-to coping strategy if I'm feeling very stressed. So I avoid, because then I won't get hurt or I won't fail. But how I've managed to cope with that is having a routine, and that's why throughout this period I've been so grateful for my work, because that has been my routine. But also what I still do to this day is, like Dan said, I'm a great believer in writing things down. I think there's something so powerful about that, and on the days that I don't have work, I will actively try and make a small list for myself for the next day, to the point where I will write down the smallest things, even what time I'm planning to get up. And like Dan said, every time I write that stuff down, I'm much more likely to achieve that stuff, and feel much feel much better for it. So definitely really important to have that routine.
It's making that deal with yourself, isn't it, in terms of okay, I'm going to do this. I mean, I enjoy a good list. It helps me manage, particularly at work, you know, when emails are coming in and demands are being placed on you. I'm writing a list as I go, and it's actually very, very nice just to cross that off and to go, right, I've done that. And definitely. You know, like you say, just having that routine, starting small, not having that big pressure on yourself to go run a marathon or, you know, spend a day in the gym when they're open. It's kind of just starting off with the smallest of things. And Eleanor, I'd like to go back to you and sort of say, have you got another sort of top tip for us?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this next one links on quite nicely to what Dan was saying. So the next top tip to managing stress is to pace yourself. So, you know, quite often when we're stressed, we might perhaps take on too much, and it might feel like we're juggling lots of different things and trying to get everything done. But actually just almost taking a step back and again breaking activities down into manageable chunks. It's so important to try and pace yourself. And again, you know, reach out for support if you need help with these tasks as well. Quite often we sort of slip into a pattern we often called boom and bust. So, you know, you might get that boom of energy where you feel like you want to get everything done and tick everything off your to-do list. But actually, if we try and take on everything and don't pace ourselves, we might experience that bust the next day, where we really lack energy, we're really feeling unmotivated and lethargic perhaps. So yeah, we want to try and even it out and pace ourselves.
And it's interesting, going back to the peer support worker examples we had, there was one about stress being the fuel, wasn't it? The stress was the fuel that kept me going. So I'm just going to do this and I'm going to do this. And I think, Andrea, you said, you know, when you're just doing everything and you know, someone else was saying it's how leads into making mistakes, and it just keeps going round and round and in this circle. And it is being able to take that step back, isn't it, and go, okay, there's this I need to do, there's this and this and this, but like Andrea said, is it a total necessity that the washing up is done immediately? Can it wait? Can I put that to another point in time in my planning of my routine to when I'm going to fit it in? And going back to that self-care and being very kind to ourselves as well. And Dan, is there another top tip that you have?
Yeah, of course. So another top tip would be to think about taking a step back from unhelpful ways of thinking and unhelpful coping strategies. So what do I mean by unhelpful ways of thinking? Well, what we tend to notice is, again, when stressed, when feeling low, we might experience many unhelpful thoughts, anything from perhaps kind of feeling that we're worthless, everything I do is wrong, why does nothing ever go right for me, for example. And these unhelpful thoughts will often stop us doing things that we want to do. So if you can imagine thinking that perhaps kind of I'm a failure or I'm a burden, you can imagine kind of how that might impact what we do. We might kind of avoid doing things because of those ways of thinking. And what we find as well is that the more unhelpful thoughts that we have, the less confident we become, our self-esteem lowers. And because of that, we then experience further unhelpful thoughts. So unhelpful thoughts kind of beget unhelpful thoughts, and again kind of indicates kind of this vicious cycle. So something that we kind of recommend really is to kind of take a step back and kind of notice those unhelpful thoughts as and when they appear, and almost kind of name them in a way. This can be quite difficult to do initially because we're not usually in the I guess kind of process of spending a lot of time thinking about how we think. So a kind of key tip to kind of think about would be just to think about perhaps kind of a time in which you're experiencing perhaps an unpleasant emotion. It could be sadness, guilt, shame, anxiety, worry, and have a think about what's going through your mind. What kind of thoughts are you experiencing, and try and capture them and acknowledge them and name them. And then it's thinking about, well, questioning that way of thinking. You know, I'm thinking I'm a burden. Well, is that 100% true? What evidence do I have to suggest that? What evidence do I have to suggest otherwise? Or am I jumping to any conclusions here? Am I making predictions based on little evidence? Am I making any assumptions, for example? And what you'll find is that if you can kind of capture those thoughts and if you can start questioning them, you can actually change the way that you kind of think about situations in yourself, and you'll notice kind of the impact on the reduction of kind of stress and an improved mood as a consequence. And to this,
I'm sorry, Dan, I jumped in there. You've got another bit, haven't you? Sorry.
That's okay, Rachel. And to the second point, talking about perhaps kind of unhelpful coping mechanisms or strategies. I think, again, commonly when we're stressed, we will oftentimes turn to those unhelpful coping strategies. And it's understandable, isn't it? Because they tend to be the things that are immediate and easy to get hold of, and they give us a sense of immediate gratification or relief. You know, whether it perhaps be sleeping more to kind of ignore the way in which we're feeling or to get through the day, perhaps kind of having a glass of wine in the evening, smoking, avoiding doing certain things, etc. Again, understandable that we'll turn to those because they give us immediate relief. But have a think, do they help long term, or actually are they kind of part of the problem? So again, it's kind of worth acknowledging those, thinking about the impact that those coping strategies might have on your stress longer term. And is there anything that you can do differently in place of that? We've talked about building up activity throughout today's podcast. Is there kind of other activities that you could perhaps kind of start incorporating in lieu of those more unhelpful ways of coping?
Thanks, Dan. Really interesting. Like you said, with the unhelpful thoughts, you know, when I jumped in then, I'm like, oh no, I'm not supposed to be doing that now. Those unhelpful thoughts are now hitting my head going, oh, you did that. And you think, actually, no, because, you know, if I get into those unhelpful thoughts, it's then going to, like we say, cause those mistakes as well, because it's going to be the stress is building and we've got the rest of the podcast to do. And, you know, actually what I'm going to do is move back from that unhelpful coping strategy of staying with those thoughts and just go, do you know what, it's all right, it's okay, carry on, and go from there. And it is interesting, isn't it, when we get caught up in these things, how easy it is to get caught up into those thoughts and then go to other things there. And Andrea, I remember you mentioned something earlier on about sort of unhelpful thoughts. What were you kind of thinking when Dan was giving his top tips?
Okay, well, I was thinking about my two most unhelpful thoughts. So the first one is, if I take time out and I'm not constantly busy, that makes me lazy. That's not true, because, well, I can't think how many people in the world take time out for themselves. Probably everyone apart from me. They're certainly not lazy. And also that doing things for me makes me selfish, because like I said before, I always like to think I can do things for other people, make their lives a little bit better. An example of that is, since we've been working from home, I've spent a lot of time looking at the screen, and I've been a lot more tired than when we used to work out in the community. And I've got some friends that I go to, I haven't, when we've been able to meet socially distanced, gone out for a walk with, or seen a couple of times a week. But sometimes I'm just too tired. So I feel that I've let them down if I contact them and let them know I can't make it. But when I do, they're fine about it. Never once do they say you've let me down. They're more concerned for my welfare and well-being, and that I'm looking after myself. And actually, they check in on me a couple of days later. So, yeah, that's how those unhelpful thoughts can become. But in reality, they're not how the situation is.
Yeah, like Dan said, are we making assumptions?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just really interesting how these things all kind of feed in and sort of help each other. You know, like you said, you're having those unhelpful thoughts about taking time for yourself is lazy. It's not, but, you know, that's the unhelpful thought that you're having. But what you've done is reached out. So you've not got on that thought train and allowed that to continue. You've reached out to your friends and you said, look, I'd love to do this, but I can't because I'm really tired. I'm going to take some time out for myself. Can we put a date in the diary? You know, can we do that? And that's how reaching out kind of looks different for different things, doesn't it? You know, like we said, and it goes into self-care and it goes into that self-compassion. It can also help you with your routine in terms of, I am going to regularly take time for myself because I know that if I don't put that into my routine, I won't do it. So, you know, it's really fascinating that, yes, these top tips seem separate, but actually they tend to go all together as well, hand in hand. And I think that's really useful when we're trying to deal with things, is to have things that intuitively kind of go together. One of the things that we can use is something called a wellness action plan. Now, I won't go into details about that too much now, because we do have a wellness action plan podcast. So, you know, please do take a listen to that. But a wellness action plan can help us to think about how we manage our stress levels, what things do we need to do. But like I say, take a listen to that if that's of interest. Holly, another thing that we kind of think about in terms of when we're working with people who are sort of stressed and managing difficult things is the 5 ways to well-being. Would you mind roughly sort of giving us a brief idea as to what those are?
No, I love the 5 ways to wellbeing. I myself try and use them as much as possible on a daily basis. I think they're great. So the first one that we've got is to give and volunteer, and that can be the smallest thing. It could just be simply smiling at someone as you pass them on the street. So these things don't have to be big things. I think that's really important to say. The second one is to be active. We're constantly going on, aren't we, about how important it is to be active for our physical health, but actually we know now that it is just as important for our mental health as well. And what I want to say here is that actually we're not saying you have to go to the gym or anything. Trust me, you won't be seeing me at the gym anytime
Me neither,
soon.
Holly. Me neither. It's not my thing.
Even when they open, you won't see me there. So yeah, it could be something very, very tiny, but also I think what I found really helpful for myself with the Be Active one is to find something you're going to enjoy as well, because of course you're more likely to keep doing it, aren't you, if you're going to enjoy it. So the next one is to take notice. Now, this is certainly a work in progress for myself, I have to admit. I'm not the best at this one, but I do try and practice it. So yeah, trying living in the present moment rather than, like we often do, thinking too much about the past or worrying too much about the future. Again, like I said, a work in progress on my part, certainly. The next sorry, Rachel, you going to say something?
Yeah, sorry, no, I was going to say, you've said take notice is a work in practice for you. I would say Be Active is the same for me. Definitely the same as you, Holly. You won't be finding me at a gym when they open, but like you said, it is finding what works for you. And like with take notice, it's finding what works for you, isn't it? Is Absolutely. It the smallest thing that you can do to continue to do that? So yeah, carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. And then our next one is my personal favourite, is to keep learning. I'm so passionate about this one. I think it helps us to stay young. It keeps us from going around that constant hamster wheel of life, where we're getting up, working, then going to bed again, whereas it really shakes up our routine, I think, if we try and actively learn something new. And again, it doesn't have to be massive. It could be learning a new recipe or signing up to a short online course. The world's your oyster with that one. And then finally, but certainly not the least important, is to connect. And I guess that's one of the things that has been really, really difficult for all of us throughout the last year. But of course, there are so many different ways that we can do that now. We're so lucky. We've got the internet, we've got social media, we've got our phones. So yeah, again, finding the smallest ways to connect. I have to admit, I love my alone time as much as anyone, but I also realise that I have to balance that with time with others as well. So yeah, those are our 5 ways to wellbeing.
Yeah, and again, going back to how all of these things go in together, if you're thinking about re-establishing a routine, you're thinking about pacing yourself. So, yes, those are the things that you need to be doing, but actually, how can we put these things into our day? Those little moments. If I'm thinking about me, it's like, well, how can I be active in my routine? Well, I kind of do it by finding small moments in the day where I'm at least getting up from my chair, away from my laptop, and I might do some more energetic things if the mood takes me. But it's interesting how these things can just all go together. Taking notice goes back to Eleanor's top tip of acknowledging how things are for you, taking notice of you as well as your environment and how things are going, and actually putting these top tips for stress into place is you learning. You're learning how to manage these different things. And, you know, like you say, connection at the moment, we've had to think outside the box to be able to do it. So yeah, just really fascinating how all of these things can all go together to help you, you know, in through difficult times. So thank you, everybody. So just kind of thinking about sort of bringing the podcast all together. So we've taken a look at what is stress, and we've given you some top tips for managing it. Our next podcast will be looking at how nature and the environment can support our mental health.
You can also find some links that relate to today's podcast in the podcast notes, so it's worth having a look at those.
If you're listening to this today and thinking that a referral to the Wellbeing Service would be useful, you can do so by visiting our website or over the telephone. If you're currently having treatment within the Wellbeing Service and would like to have peer support, then please do speak to your therapist who can make the referral for you. So I'd like to say a big thank you to my podcast contributors for today's podcast. Thank you so much for your really interesting sort of top tips and the sort of discussions that we've had. I'd like to thank you guys who are listening to the podcast for joining us and listening in, and I hope you'll be able to join us again for our next podcast, which will be focusing on how nature and the environment can support our mental health. So I'll say goodbye. Goodbye.
Okay, and I'm going to say goodbye as well. Thank you so much for listening today.
And yeah, goodbye from me as well. And thank you all so much for listening and tuning in today.
Yeah, goodbye from me too. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast.
And finally, it's a goodbye from me as well. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you got a lot from the podcast. Take care.
Thanks everyone. Bye.